I realized I don't think I've ever actually introduced myself in any of my videos. So my name is Kim Wilson, and I've recently decided that I like watching horror movies from the 50s, or at least vintage horror movies, or what I call vintage horror movies. So yeah, without any further ado, I'm going to get into The Blob in 1958. Interesting fact, this was Steve McQueen's first leading role, and I have to say he's fantastic in it. This is actually the first and only Steve McQueen movie I've seen. I definitely added The Great Escape to my list though, because I heard that he's fantastic in that. A bit of trivia about Steve McQueen in that film is that he performed all of his own stunts. So yeah, without any further ado, I'm just going to jump straight in. So the film starts with a jaunty barbershop style number as the opening titles appear on screen. Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor right through the door. What's funny is that Steve McQueen's character is also named Steve. So we see the characters Steve and Jane, they're out on a date at Lover's Lane. Fun fact here, because I actually had to look this up afterwards because I wasn't sure what age group these characters were meant to be in. Like, Jane does look quite young, but Steve McQueen was 28 at the time of filming and he's playing a teenager. I'm not here to judge, okay? I'm 32, but I look about 75 with all my wrinkles, so I'm not here to judge. If I judge, it's the pot calling the kettle black. Steve and Jane, while out on their date, they witness a meteorite crashing. Steve is very curious and he wants to go and investigate. However, an old man who lives in the area gets to the meteorite first. So the old man is investigating. It's like, what's this mysterious glowing meteorite? It just doesn't look like your average shooting star or meteor. So he picks up a stick and pokes at it. It cracks open and reveals the blob. Anyway, so the blob attaches itself onto the man's hand. He starts screaming in pain and he can't get it off. He's like pulling at it and that blob ain't going anywhere. It's a part of him now. So he takes off running and screaming through the woods, ends up at the road where Steve and Jane are driving on their way to go investigate the meteorite. Steve narrowly misses hitting him with his car. Steve hops out and checks the guy out, can see that the guy's clearly in distress. It seems like he and Jane are from a small town, so they take him to the nearest doctor's office, which is Dr. Helen. Okay, I have put way too much eyeshadow on my lower under eye, but we're just gonna roll with it and just pretend like that's what we wanted to do. So Helen examines the hand. The blob has now turned red, presumably because it's sucking the life out of this poor fella. Steve comments that it's actually grown bigger. It was not that big on his hand and it hadn't like spread down to his wrist yet. So needless to say, the three of them are kind of freaking out right now. And this poor guy is just in so much pain. Helen decides to sedate him. He asks Steve and Jane if they could go back to where they found the gentleman and just see if they can find any information, any clues, anything that could give them some information as to, you know, what this poor guy's going through and what this blob is exactly. So they do drive back out to where they were. They do find the meteorite and they're sort of looking at it and they kind of go, oh, this must be the meteorite. And Steve goes, well, what's left of it? You know, like he's thinking, it's as if he knew that something had come out of it. You know, it's as if he knew the whole thing wasn't there. Meanwhile, back at Helen's office, he checks on the elderly man now that he's being sedated. And now the blob has already moved up to his elbow. So Helen's starting to think, okay, I don't know what this thing is, but clearly it is causing harm to this man. I think I'm going to have to amputate. So he calls for his nurse, Kate, to come in to assist him. So by the time Kate gets to Helen's practice, the man is actually completely consumed by the blob. The man has been completely consumed, and now the blob, going from just being something that was attached to his hand, is now its own being, if you will. It's a giant gelatinous blob. It kind of looks like congealed blood. The ladies at home know what I'm talking about. Kate sadly ends up being the blob's next victim. As Helen goes to get his gun, he fires a couple of shots at the blob. They do nothing. Steve and Jane come back to Helen's office. Steve witnesses Helen being consumed by the blob. They go to the police. They grab Lieutenant Dave Barton and Sergeant Jim Burt. Had to write those names down. I knew I would forget them. We're just going to call them Dave and Jim moving forward. So they go to the police station, grab those two, take them back to Helen's office, and Steve explains exactly what he saw. Now, as you can imagine, Dave and Jim do not believe him. They basically think, oh, you kids and your pranks, just making a cop's life harder than it already is. So there's no sign of the blob or the victims. Like, this blob just consumes, well, pretty much anything in its path, but particularly living things, and doesn't leave any trace whatsoever of its victims. It also doesn't leave like a trail. It doesn't leave an excretion of any kind, you know, like a snail or something. So because the police don't believe Steve, he then decides to go and recruit his friends who are currently in the middle of a movie at the local cinema. Meanwhile, also in town, the blob has made its way from Helen's office to a local repair shop and finds its next victim, an innocent mechanic who is working on a car. Steve and his friends, they sort of go around town, they try to warn people, of course nobody believes them, and while they're driving around, Steve and Jane, they happen to be driving past the grocery store that Steve's dad owns, and yeah, just as they're travelling past, they notice, oh, the front door to the grocery store is unlocked. Well, that doesn't sound right. I wonder if the janitor's just working late. So they go in to investigate, and they encounter the blob. There's absolutely no explanation as to why the door's unlocked. It's not like the blob plowed through it and smashed it and left it damaged. It's just unlocked. I guess the blob can unlock doors. Like, why not? It is an alien after all. Who knows what it's capable of? Anyway, they're in the grocery store. They can't really get around it. It's blocking the way to the exit. So seeking refuge, they run to the walk-in freezer right at the back of the store. And just when they think all hope is lost, as they see the blob oozing itself under the door, they, just as quickly as they see it oozing in, they see it oozing back out again. And Steve's like, oh, that's weird. They eventually pluck up the courage and leave the freezer. Blob is nowhere to see. Blob has completely left the grocery store. So Steve and Jane meet up with the rest of Steve's friends. And as you can imagine, his friends have not had any luck either with anyone believing them. So Steve's like, you know what? Let's set up the city's air raid alarms and fire alarms, and then people have to listen to us. That's exactly what they do. Everyone gathers in town. At first, the police don't realize who set off the alarms. They have their suspicions, but they can't prove it. The blob has now made its way to the cinema, the very cinema that Steve recruited his friends from. The blob consumes the poor projectionist and then oozes its way into the auditorium or the theatre, basically where the audience are. Next minute, everyone's gathered around town. The police are there with the whole town. Next minute, they hear people screaming and running through the town. These are the people who are from the cinema. And then the police are like, okay, we believe you now, Steve. Because then they see the blob like chasing after these poor audience members. So the blob appears in amongst the crowd. Jane spots her little brother Danny. Danny gets scared and he runs into a nearby diner. Steve and Jane see little Danny run into this diner and they quickly follow in after him. So the blob starts to slowly cover the diner, presumably to consume the diner itself and everybody inside, which is Steve, Jane, Danny, and the owner of the diner and a waitress. What I find interesting is that the blob just seems to plow through everything. I mean, it absorbs bullets, but I guess it's struggling with the diner, maybe because of the sheer size of the diner. I don't know. I feel like it's not fully explained. It seems to consume living flesh quicker than inanimate objects, maybe something along those lines. Sorry guys, don't know what happened. My camera stopped recording, so I was just explaining that they decide to shoot down the power line in the hopes that electrocuting the blob will kill it. Don't know what happened there. My camera just decided to stop filming. Anyway, so I guess the police and the fire department have recently watched Attack of the 50-Foot Woman and were like, yeah, the destroying the power lines worked on that broad, so let's try it on this thing. So they shoot down the power line, it hits the blob, it shoots through a very powerful electrical current, however it doesn't affect the blob in any way. Unfortunately, what does happen is it causes the diner to catch fire, this electrical current. Steve grabs the fire extinguisher and starts to put out the fire that is quickly spreading to inside the diner where they are. He then notices the blob starting to retreat a little bit. And it reminds him of when he and Jane were in the walk-in freezer, how the blob didn't want to go in any further. So he goes, aha, the blob hates cold. He relays this information to Dave, who had been tapped into the diner's phone this whole time, and he manages to communicate, hey, this thing hates the cold. Can you round up some fire extinguishers, CO2 kinds? Interestingly enough, the fire department, they don't have many. They only have like 3 or 4 of them. So they're thinking, where are we going to get these fire extinguishers from? Like, which place would have an abundance of them? And at that moment, Jane's dad, who is the principal of the high school, he goes, oh, I know where there's heaps, at the high school. So he rounds up a bunch of high school students. They go to the school, they grab all the fire extinguishers. It's pretty epic, that scene when they're all coming back, all these cars, like a combination of cops and high schoolers, and they all have fire extinguishers. They aim the fire extinguishers at the blob covering the diner and get it cold enough to the point where it pretty much freezes. Sadly, this doesn't kill the blob, but it does subdue it enough for Steve, Jane, Danny, and the diner and the diner owner and the waitress to escape. Meanwhile, Dave has been on the phone with Washington and he explains the situation and he says, look, I think this thing needs to be airlifted over to the Arctic, to a place that's super cold all the time. The final scene is of the blob parachuting down into the middle of the Arctic ice field, and because, you know, the cold doesn't actually kill it, it just subdues it. Closing words at the end appear on screen and they morph into a question mark. Pretty much finished my look, just gotta put my lipstick on. I'll just give you a couple of fun facts about the movie. So the theme song at the start that I ever so graciously sang for you at the start of this video, it was actually written by Burt Bacharach of all people. Burt Bacharach, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Burt Bacharach.
What the world needs now is love, sweet love.
Which I found interesting. Like, he's given us some great songs like Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head and then the theme song to The Blob. I guess this movie just had more of an impact than I originally thought. It's a fantastic movie. I think everybody should watch it. So the diner at the end of the film is called Downingtown Diner, and it is a real diner in Pennsylvania. A friend of mine has been there. He said that it has changed. It doesn't look exactly as to how the movie looks. You know, the movie came out in 1958, so I think I'm quite grateful that it's still there and it's still an actual diner that you can actually go and have a meal. And I believe the cellar where they were all like hiding just before the end of the movie, I believe that's still pretty much as it was back in the 50s. And on certain days during the week, customers can go down to the cellar and take photos if they wish. So that's kind of cool. Also Phoenixville, which I think is where The Blob was filmed. I will add some texture if that's incorrect. But Phoenixville, apparently since the early 2000s, have held an annual Blob Fest where, and during Blob Fest, you can recreate the scene where the terrified audience members are fleeing the cinema and screaming. So that sounds fun. I think that's all I have to say about this movie. Let me know what you guys think if you have seen this movie. Hopefully you guys like this look as well. Before I watched this movie, admittedly I thought that the Blob was purple. I don't know where I got that concept from. Maybe I thought the Blob was like Lumpy Space Princess from Adventure Time or something. And then I found out it's actually, you know, bright red, the color of blood. So yeah, if you like this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will be seeing you next week. Bye.